Congresswoman Maxine Waters expected to humiliate her opponents on national television, but she was completely blindsided when Senator Ted Cruz unleashed a single manila folder that systematically dismantled her 3-4-year political empire in minutes. Your family made over $1 million from your political connections while you lecture Americans about corruption. The words hit Congresswoman Maxine Waters like a physical blow. Her face went completely white as Senator Ted Cruz continued reading from official documents. Your husband owned $350,000 in one United Bank stock. You arranged the Treasury meeting. The bank got $12 million in taxpayer bailouts. Waters sat frozen, speechless. The woman who had dominated Washington banking policy for 34 years was being systematically destroyed on live television by a man she had dismissed as just a junior senator from Texas. But how did we get here? Picture this. 45 minutes earlier, the most powerful woman in American banking walks into a Senate hearing room planning to humiliate another Republican on national television. She's never lost a banking debate. She's stared down Treasury secretaries. This is supposed to be her victory lap. What she doesn't know is that the quiet man in the corner has spent 3 weeks building a devastating case, and he's about to unleash it. This is the story of how constitutional knowledge destroyed 34 years of accumulated power in less than an hour. How a Harvard Law graduate with a pocket constitution brought down a political dynasty. How one prepared senator reminded Washington that in America, nobody is above the law. Senate Banking Committee, live on every network. Waters requested this hearing to destroy Republican banking opposition. Sees Cruz name, laughs Hez, just a senator. I'm the expert. But Cruz has been preparing for 3 weeks. Ethics reports, financial records, constitutional violations, all documented. Already, Waters adjusts her microphone confidently. Cruz opens his folder for the last time. The ambush is about to begin. Waters leaned forward in her chair, fixing Cruz with the withering stare that had made Fortune 500 CEOs stumble over their words. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had never lost a banking debate, someone who had been wielding power since before Cruz was even in politics. Senator Cruz, I'm genuinely curious. What exactly qualifies a junior senator from Texas to lecture this committee about financial regulation? Did Harvard Law School actually cover banking law? Or were you too busy with abstract constitutional theory to learn about real-world economics? The room stirred uncomfortably. Waters had just publicly questioned a Harvard Law graduate's credentials on national television. It was a bold opening move designed to put Cruz on the defensive and establish her dominance immediately. Several Democratic committee members nodded approvingly. This was the Maxine Waters. They remembered the fierce partisan who never backed down from a fight, who could eviscerate Republicans with surgical precision. But Cruz's smile never wavered. If anything, it seemed to grow slightly warmer as he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small, worn booklet, the Pocket Constitution, that had become his trademark throughout his Senate career. Congresswoman Waters. That's a fascinating question, he said, his Texas drawl making each word deliberate and measured. But may I ask you something in return? What specific constitutional authority gives Congress unlimited power to regulate American banking? The question hung in the air like a live grenade. Waters' confident expression flickered, just for a moment, but every camera in the room caught that brief flash of uncertainty. This wasn't the response she had expected. Republicans usually became defensive when she questioned their credentials, started explaining their qualifications, got flustered. Cruz was turning the tables with quiet confidence. Waters straightened in her chair, clearly irritated by the unexpected pushback. Her voice took on the sharp, prosecutorial edge that had made her famous in Democratic circles. "Senator, don't lecture me about constitutional authority. I've been defending the Constitution and American families for 34 years, while you've been playing political games in Texas. Mom, with all due respect," Cruz replied, opening the Constitution to a specific page with practiced precision. "I'm not playing games. I'm reading Article 1, Section 8, which lists the 18 specific powers granted to Congress by the Constitution. Banking regulation isn't explicitly listed among those powers. So under what constitutional theory do you justify the CFPB's existence?" The room had gone completely silent. This wasn't the softball questioning Waters had expected. Cruz was asking fundamental questions about constitutional authority that went to the heart of federal power questions she had never seriously considered in her 3 decades of expanding government regulation. Waters felt the first flutter of real panic. She'd spent her entire career assuming constitutional authority, never questioning it, never having to defend it against someone who actually understood constitutional law at the Supreme Court level. Her voice took on a defensive edge. "The Commerce Clause clearly gives us authority to regulate financial institutions. That's basic constitutional law, Senator." Cruz nodded patiently, like a constitutional law professor with a particularly unprepared student. "The Commerce Clause allows Congress to regulate interstate commerce, yes. But does that include creating an unaccountable bureaucracy with unlimited power to write rules that have the force of law without specific congressional authorization? Because that sounds less like regulating commerce and more like legislative abdication." He flipped to another page in his Constitution with practiced ease. "You see, Mom, James Madison wrote in Federalist 45 that the powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined. Where exactly did the Constitution define Congress power to create agencies that can write binding regulations without explicit legislative authority?" Waters realized she was in much deeper water than expected. The constitutional scholar from Texas wasn't backing down, and worse, he was exposing her fundamental ignorance of the document she'd sworn to uphold 18 times over her career. Every senator in that room was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a sitting committee chair being given a remedial constitutional law lesson on national television. "Senator Cruz, the Constitution is a living document," Waters said, falling back on the standard progressive talking point that had served her well for decades. "The founders couldn't have anticipated modern banking systems. We have to adapt constitutional principles to contemporary challenges." It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Cruz's smile broadened as he sensed vulnerability. "Congresswoman, that's a fascinating interpretation, but if the Constitution means whatever Congress decides it means in any given moment, then it doesn't actually limit government power at all, does it? You're essentially arguing that the document you swore to uphold and defend is meaningless whenever it becomes inconvenient." He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the authority of someone who had argued constitutional cases before the Supreme Court and won. "The founders actually anticipated this exact problem. That's why they included the 10th Amendment, which explicitly states that powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states and the people, respectively. They knew that politicians would always want more power than the Constitution grants them." Waters was now visibly flustered. 34 years of political experience meant nothing when faced with actual constitutional knowledge and legal expertise. She had walked into this hearing expecting to debate banking policy and regulatory effectiveness. Instead, she was getting a masterclass in constitutional law from someone who had actually studied and practiced it at the highest levels of American jurisprudence. "I don't need a lecture from you about constitutional principles," she snapped, her composure beginning to crack for the first time in years. I've been fighting for working families and defending democracy since before you were even in politics." "Mom," Cruz replied with devastating calm, "fighting for working families is indeed admirable, but the Constitution doesn't grant Congress power to do whatever it thinks is good for working families. It grants specific, enumerated powers, and nowhere in those 18 carefully defined powers do I see unlimited banking regulation or creating unaccountable bureaucracies that can write binding law." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the finishing blow. "The genius of our constitutional system is that it constrains government power, even when that government has good intentions. Especially when it has good intentions, because the founders understood that the road to tyranny is paved with politicians who believe their good intentions justify exceeding constitutional limits." The first round was over, and everyone in the room knew who had won. Waters had walked into a constitutional buzzsaw, and her usual tactics of personal attacks and righteous indignation had proven utterly useless against actual legal knowledge and constitutional expertise. The Banking Committee chair, who had dominated Washington for decades, was being systematically schooled by a senator she had tried to dismiss as unqualified. But this was just the beginning. Cruz had much more devastating ammunition waiting in his manila folder. Sensing grave political danger, Waters did what she always did. When cornered, she went on the attack with everything she had. Her voice rose with righteous indignation, echoing through the committee room with the force of 3 decades of accumulated political rage. "Don't you dare lecture me about constitutional authority, Senator. At least I've never sold out working families to Wall Street donors like your party does every single day. I've spent my entire career fighting for the little guy, while Republicans like you carry water for big banks and corporate interests." It was a calculated move, designed to shift the debate away from constitutional law, where she was clearly and embarrassingly outmatched, to political rhetoric and partisan attacks, where she felt more comfortable and confident. The Democratic members of the committee nodded approvingly. This was their champion, their fighter, pushing back against Republican hypocrisy with the moral authority of someone who had dedicated her life to economic justice. But it was exactly the wrong move. Cruz's eyes lit up with something approaching predatory satisfaction, as his hand moved deliberately to the manila folder head who'd been carrying throughout the hearing. In that single moment, Waters had just walked directly into the trap head, spent 3 weeks carefully preparing. She had given him the perfect opening to destroy her credibility permanently. Cruz opened the folder with deliberate, theatrical precision. The sound of papers rustling was clearly audible in the silent room. When he looked up, his expression had undergone a subtle but unmistakable transformation from polite academic to seasoned courtroom prosecutor. This was a man who had argued 9 cases before the Supreme Court of the United States, and he was about to demonstrate exactly why he had never lost. "Congresswoman, since you mentioned fighting for working families and avoiding conflicts with financial institutions, I'd like to discuss One United Bank with you." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Waters' face went completely pale, her confident posture crumbling as if she'd been physically struck by a sledgehammer. Her hands gripped the edge of the table as she realized what was coming next. Every reporter in that room who knew Washington politics understood exactly what Cruz had just done. Had just dropped a massive political bombshell. The name One United hung in the air like a death sentence. Committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly remembering why they'd heard that name before. Democratic staffers frantically began whispering among themselves, their faces showing barely concealed panic. Waters' own staff looked like they wanted to disappear under the table. Cruz pulled out a simple calculator and began reading from his documents with surgical precision, his voice carrying the methodical authority of a prosecutor presenting ironclad evidence to a jury. For those watching at home who may not be familiar with One United Bank, Let me provide some essential context. In September 2008, during the height of the financial crisis, Congresswoman Waters personally arranged a meeting between Treasury Department officials and representatives from this minority-owned bank. He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words sink in while Waters sat frozen in horror. What she didn't disclose at the time, and what subsequent investigations revealed, was that her husband, Sidney Williams, owned $350,000 worth of stock in that same bank and had served on its board of directors from 2004 to 2008. Waters tried to interrupt, her voice cracking with desperation. That's ancient history. I was completely cleared by the House Ethics Committee after a full investigation. Mom, please let me finish. Cruz continued with devastating calm, his finger moving methodically down the page as he read from official documents. After the meeting, you personally arranged a meeting where Treasury officials were surprised to discover that One United was the only minority bank. Represented One United Bank received $12 million in taxpayer bailout, funds from the Troubled Asset Relief Program. He looked up from his documents, his eyes meeting Waters' terrified gaze directly. Your family's investment was saved. Your husband's stock didn't become worthless. The bank your family had a significant financial stake in received a taxpayer-funded bailout after a meeting you arranged. The room was dead silent, except for the sound of reporters frantically scribbling notes and camera shutters clicking. Waters looked like she was having trouble breathing. Cruz wasn't finished. He pulled out another document from his folder. But the story gets even more interesting. According to the House Ethics Committee's own investigation, your chief of staff at the time, who happens to be your grandson, Mikael Moore, was found to be actively involved in helping One United Bank secure federal assistance. Waters' voice rose to nearly a shout. My grandson was doing his job. There was nothing improper about. Mom, Cruz interrupted with surgical precision. Your grandson sent emails specifically about One United being in trouble. He provided the bank with draft legislation. He maintained contact with bank executives on your behalf, all while your family had hundreds of thousands of dollars at stake. He reached for his calculator and began punching in numbers. Let me break this down for the American people watching. $350,000, represented between 4.6% and 15.2% of your family's total net worth. If One United had failed, as the Ethics Committee noted, your husband's investment would have been worthless. The mathematical precision of the corruption was devastating. Waters tried desperately to defend herself. I believed I was helping all minority banks. I didn't know the meeting would focus on One United. Cruz's response was swift and merciless. Mom, you personally arranged a meeting between Treasury officials and banks, and you didn't know which bank would be discussed? Either you're lying about your knowledge of the meeting's purpose, or you're admitting to gross negligence in handling conflicts of interest. Which is it? The question hung in the air like a sword over Waters' head. There was no good answer, and everyone in the room knew it. But Cruz wasn't finished. He pulled out yet another document. According to Los Angeles Times reporting from 2004, your relatives made over $1 million during your time in Congress by doing business with companies and candidates you helped. Your daughter, Karen Waters, and son, Edward Waters, have repeatedly profited from your political connections and influence. His voice took on a tone of moral authority. This isn't about fighting for working families, Congresswoman. This is about systematically enriching your own family through your political position. You arranged bailouts for banks where your family had financial interests. You hired your grandson as your chief of staff, and he helped secure federal funds for companies that benefited your family financially. Waters was now visibly shaking with a combination of rage and panic. You have no right to attack my family. They've done nothing wrong. I'm not attacking your family, Mom, Cruz replied with deadly calm. I'm reading from public records, ethics committee reports, and newspaper investigations. The question is, why do you think your family should profit from your public service while you sit here lecturing others about corruption and corporate influence? He leaned back in his chair, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that somehow made his words even more devastating. You walked into this hearing accusing me of being corrupted by corporate interests, but the documented evidence shows that you have personally arranged federal bailouts for institutions where your family had significant financial stakes. You've enriched your relatives through your political connections. You've turned public service into a family business. The destruction was complete. Waters sat in stunned silence, unable to form coherent words. The woman who had accused Cruz of corruption had just been systematically exposed as the embodiment of everything Americans hate about Washington politics: the use of public office for private gain, the enrichment of family members, the abuse of power for personal financial benefit. But Cruz had saved his most devastating ammunition for last. With her back against the wall and her credibility in ruins, Waters made one final, desperate attempt to turn the tables. Her voice cracked with barely contained panic as she reached for the only weapon she had left. How dare you question my ethics when your party supported the January 6th Capitol incident? You want to talk about constitutional violations? Let's talk about Republicans trying to subvert democracy and incite aggressive actions against the United States government. It was her last card, played with the desperation of someone whose career was hanging by a thread. She was hoping to shift the conversation away from her documented corruption to partisan politics about January 6th, where she felt she might have some moral high ground. But it was exactly what Cruz had been waiting for. His patient smile returned as he reached for another document from his seemingly endless folder. He had been preparing for this exact moment, this exact deflection, and he was ready to deliver the coup de grace. Cruz sat back in his chair, his demeanor shifting once again, this time from prosecutor to constitutional law professor, delivering a lecture that would be remembered for decades. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had not only studied constitutional law, but had defended it before the highest court in the land. Congresswoman, let's examine your claim about inciting aggressive actions and constitutional violations. On January 6th, I spoke about the constitutional process for objecting to electoral votes, a process that has been used by Democrats in 2001, 2005, and 2017. I called for peaceful, lawful protest within constitutional bounds. He lifted a transcript from his folder with deliberate ceremony. But let's talk about your track record with incitement. On the 17th of April 2021, you stood before protesters in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, a city that had been experiencing severe civil unrest for days, and said, and I'm reading your exact words here, "We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Waters tried to interrupt, but Cruz pressed forward relentlessly. This wasn't a peaceful rally, Congresswoman. This was during active civil unrest. Buildings were set ablaze. Businesses were being ransacked. Police officers were being attacked. And you told protesters to get more confrontational. He pulled out another transcript, but that wasn't an isolated incident. On the 25th of June 2018, you told a crowd of your supporters at a rally in Los Angeles, if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome anymore. Anywhere. Waters tried desperately to defend herself. I was talking about peaceful protest. I never called for violence. Cruz's response was swift and devastating. Mom, What did you think would happen when you told people to get more confrontational during unrest that had already turned violent? What did you think pushback meant when you were specifically targeting individual government officials? Either you're incredibly naive about the power and consequences of your words, or you knew exactly what you were encouraging. He pulled out yet another document. Following your 2018 comments, multiple Republican officials were systematically harassed in restaurants and public spaces. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen was confronted and driven from a Mexican restaurant by protesters chanting your exact phrases. White House advisor Stephen Miller was accosted while dining. I myself was surrounded and harassed by a mob while having dinner with my wife. His voice took on a tone of moral authority. Your words led directly to harassment, intimidation, and confrontation. You created a climate where political opponents couldn't appear in public without being mobbed. That's not peaceful protest, Congresswoman. That's systematic political intimidation. Waters was now visibly trembling. I never told anyone to be violent. I support peaceful protest. Then why? Cruz asked with surgical precision. Did you tell protesters to get more confrontational during active civil unrest? Why did you tell people to create crowds, to push back on specific individuals? Why didn't you call for calm and peaceful dialogue instead of escalation and confrontation? He leaned forward for his final blow. You see, Congresswoman, there's a fundamental difference between us. When I spoke on January 6th, I called for constitutional processes and peaceful protest within legal bounds. When you speak, you call for confrontation in the streets, harassment of government officials, and getting more confrontational while American cities burn. His voice dropped to almost a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room. One of us actually understands and respects the Constitution. The other thinks political power justifies any means necessary. Waters sat in stunned silence, but Cruz wasn't finished. He was about to deliver the final destruction. Congresswoman Waters, let's review the facts. You've served in Congress for 34 years. In that time, you've been named to the most corrupt politicians list by Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington 4 different times in 2005, 2006, 2009, and 2011. He began ticking off points on his fingers. You arranged federal bailouts for banks where your family had significant financial interests. You've systematically enriched your relatives through your political connections, with your family members making over $1 million from businesses tied to your influence. You've repeatedly called for confrontation and harassment of your political opponents. His voice took on the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. You're not a champion of working families, Mom. You're not a defender of democracy. You're exactly what the Founding Fathers feared when they designed our constitutional system. A career politician who's forgotten that in America, no one is above the law, and no one is entitled to power. He closed his folder with a decisive snap. You've spent 34 years accumulating power, influence, and wealth through your position. But you've forgotten that political power in America is supposed to be temporary, accountable, and constrained by constitutional limits. You've become the very thing our Constitution was designed to prevent. Waters sat in complete, devastating silence, her mouth slightly open, unable to form words. 34 years of accumulated power and authority had just been systematically demolished in front of a national television audience. The woman who had walked into the hearing room as the queen of banking policy was leaving as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of unchecked power and the importance of constitutional limits on government authority. The constitutional scholar from Texas had just reminded everyone watching that in America, knowledge and principles still matter more than position and power. The silence that followed Cruz's final words was unlike anything the seasoned reporters in the gallery had ever experienced. It stretched on for what felt like an eternity, thick and suffocating, as if the very air in the room had been sucked out. Committee members from both parties sat frozen in their chairs, unsure how to proceed, unwilling to be the first to break the spell that Cruz had cast. Waters remained completely motionless, staring at the table in front of her, as if trying to will herself to disappear. Her hands, which had been gesturing confidently just an hour earlier, lay flat and still on the table's surface. The woman who had dominated Washington banking policy for over 3 decades looked utterly defeated, broken in a way that no one in that room had ever seen before. Senator Chuck Grassley, the committee chairman, cleared his throat nervously, the sound abnormally loud in the silence. "Well, take a 5-minute recess," he announced, his voice uncertain. The usual formalities of thanking witnesses and scheduling follow-up questions seemed impossibly inadequate after what everyone had just witnessed. As the cameras stopped rolling, the room erupted into barely controlled chaos. Reporters rushed toward the exits, phones already pressed to their ears, knowing they had just witnessed the political story of the decade. Democratic staffers huddled around Waters, their faces showing a mixture of panic and resignation. They had just watched their champion get systematically destroyed on national television, and they knew the damage was irreversible. In the hallway outside, Waters' press secretary was already fielding a barrage of calls from reporters across the country. "No comment at this time," she repeated over and over, but her voice betrayed the panic that everyone could hear. Her communications director frantically worked his phone, trying to arrange damage control interviews. But what defense could they possibly offer against documented evidence and official ethics reports? Waters, chief of staff, the same grandson who had been mentioned repeatedly during Cruz's devastating testimony, stood against the wall, his face pale as he realized that his own role in the One United scandal was now front-page news again. The family business that had enriched the Waters clan for decades was now exposed for all America to see. Meanwhile, across the country, social media was exploding with unprecedented fury. Within minutes of the hearing's conclusion, number Waters destroyed began trending on Twitter, quickly becoming the #1 trend in America. The hashtag number constitutional scholar followed close behind, as conservative users celebrated Cruz's performance. #1 United began trending as people searched for more information about the banking scandal. Conservative Twitter erupted in celebration. Videos of Cruz's most devastating moments were being shared thousands of times per minute. The clip of Waters, sitting in stunned silence after Cruz's final blow, was already being turned into memes. The moment when she realized he was going to discuss One United Bank, the look of pure terror that crossed her face became an instant viral sensation. Liberal accounts scrambled desperately to provide context or deflect to other issues. But the damage was too clear, too well documented, too devastating to spin away. Some tried to attack Cruz's past positions or bring up January 6th again, but it felt hollow after Waters' own incitement record had been so thoroughly exposed. News networks across the spectrum were forced to cover the story. CNN ran the clips but tried to minimize their impact. Fox News led with the story for the entire evening. MSNBC desperately tried to focus on other news, but their own viewers were demanding coverage of what everyone was calling the political destruction of the decade. The most devastating clips were spreading faster than the networks could track them. The Constitutional Authority exchange, the One United bomb going off, the family corruption revelations, the confrontational trap, and finally, the complete silence as Waters realized her career was effectively over. Political analysts across the spectrum struggled to find comparable moments in American political history. Some reached back to the great Senate debates of the 19th century. Others compared it to the most devastating Supreme Court oral arguments. But most agreed that they had never seen such a systematic, documented, and complete political destruction conducted with such calm precision. Republican senators who had watched the hearing were already calling Cruz's office, wanting to associate themselves with his performance. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, never one to miss a political opportunity, released a statement within the hour Senator Cruz demonstrated today what principled constitutional leadership looks like. He showed that preparation and knowledge of our founding documents can triumph over decades of accumulated power. Democratic leadership was in complete damage control mode. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office released a carefully worded statement supporting Waters, while avoiding any mention of her actual performance. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer's staff was quietly advising Democrats to avoid commenting on the hearing entirely. The implications were already becoming clear to political insiders. Waters' effectiveness as a committee leader was permanently compromised. How could she challenge witnesses on ethics when her own ethical violations had been so thoroughly documented? How could she speak with authority on constitutional issues when she had demonstrated such fundamental ignorance of constitutional law? But beyond the immediate political implications, something more significant had happened. Cruz had demonstrated that constitutional expertise could be a devastating political weapon. Knowledge of the founding documents, preparation, and principled argumentation had triumphed over political experience, institutional power, and partisan rhetoric. A new template had been established for how to challenge the Washington establishment. Come prepared, know the Constitution, document everything, and never back down from constitutional principles. The outsider from Texas had just shown every constitutional conservative in America what was possible when someone actually understood and could articulate the founding principles of American government. The hearing had ended, but the political earthquake it triggered was just beginning. In the days following the hearing, the political landscape began to shift in ways that few observers had anticipated. Ted Cruz had not just won a debate, he had fundamentally altered the trajectory of American political discourse and his own career in the space of 45 minutes. Cruz's Senate office was flooded with interview requests from every major news network, conservative podcast, and political organization in the country. His staff, unprepared for the sudden surge in national attention, worked around the clock to manage the deluge. Speaking invitations poured in from universities, think tanks, and political organizations across the nation. Conservative donors who had never paid attention to the junior senator from Texas were suddenly eager to fund his future endeavors. More importantly, Cruz had demonstrated something that many constitutional conservatives had hoped for, but never quite seen executed so perfectly, that deep knowledge of founding principles could be wielded as an effective political weapon. His performance became required viewing in Republican strategy meetings across the country. Campaign consultants began advising their clients to study constitutional law, not just talking points. The Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, and Federalist Society all extended invitations for major addresses. Constitutional law professors began incorporating clips from the hearing into their courses, using Cruz's systematic dismantling of Waters' arguments as a teaching tool for how constitutional principles should guide policy debates. Young Republican politicians across the country took note. The old model of political success, fundraising, networking, and media manipulation was being challenged by a new approach based on intellectual preparation, constitutional expertise, and principled argumentation. Cruz had shown that there was an alternative to the shallow, sound-driven politics that had dominated Washington for decades. For Waters, the implications were far more devastating and immediate. Democratic colleagues who had once sought her endorsement and advice began distancing themselves from her controversial statements and documented ethical violations. Committee hearings that had once been her showcase became exercises in damage control. Banking executives who had once feared appearing before her committee now saw her as a wounded adversary who lacked credibility to challenge them effectively. How could someone who had been exposed for arranging bailouts for her family's financial benefit lecture others about corporate responsibility? The Democratic Party faced a broader crisis of credibility. Waters had been one of their most prominent voices on financial regulation, and her destruction raised uncomfortable questions about other long-serving members who had accumulated power without accountability. If someone with Waters' experience and institutional knowledge could be so thoroughly exposed, what did that say about the rest of the party's leadership? Progressive organizations that had long supported Waters found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't defend her documented ethical violations, but acknowledging Cruz's victory meant admitting that their champion had been fundamentally compromised. Many simply stopped mentioning her in their communications and advocacy work. The hearing sparked a broader national conversation about term limits, constitutional government, and the role of career politicians in American democracy. Cruz's argument that 34 years might be too long for any single person to hold power resonated across party lines with voters who were frustrated with Washington's permanent political class. Constitutional conservative organizations saw a surge in membership and donations. The Federalist Society reported its largest increase in new members in over a decade. Sales of pocket constitutions skyrocketed as Americans sought to educate themselves about the founding principles that Cruz had wielded so effectively. Law schools across the country began receiving inquiries about constitutional law programs from students inspired by Cruz's performance. The idea that constitutional expertise could be a path to political influence attracted a new generation of potential leaders who valued substance over style. The media landscape was forced to adapt as well. Reporters who had relied on shallow political analysis found themselves needing to actually understand constitutional law to effectively cover the new political dynamic that Cruz had created. Fact-checkers worked overtime to verify the documents and legal precedents that Cruz had cited, only to find that his preparation had been meticulous and his sources unimpeachable. International observers noted the significance of what had occurred. In an era when democratic institutions were under pressure worldwide, America had witnessed a demonstration of how constitutional knowledge and principled argumentation could provide a bulwark against corruption and abuse of power. The hearing also highlighted the educational failures that had produced someone like Waters, a politician who could serve for 34 years without ever seriously grappling with the constitutional foundations of American government. Universities across the country began examining their civic education programs, recognizing that producing informed citizens required more than just policy studies. Think tanks and research institutions began developing new programs focused on constitutional literacy for public officials. The idea that political leaders should actually understand the document they swear to uphold gained traction as more than just a conservative talking point. For the constitutional conservative movement, Cruz's performance provided a roadmap for future political engagement. Instead of simply opposing liberal policies on ideological grounds, they could challenge them on constitutional grounds, with specific legal arguments and documented evidence. The transformation in Cruz's own political standing was remarkable. Overnight, he had gone from being seen as a polarizing figure, known primarily for his opposition to Republican leadership, to being viewed as a serious constitutional scholar and potential presidential candidate. Political commentators who had dismissed him as a grandstanding outsider were forced to acknowledge his intellectual credentials and strategic acumen. The hearing had accomplished something that decades of conservative activism had failed to achieve. It had made constitutional conservatism intellectually attractive to mainstream audiences by demonstrating that constitutional knowledge could triumph over political experience. Cruz had inspired a new generation of Americans to take the founding documents seriously. But perhaps most importantly, the hearing had reminded the American people that their government operates under a written constitution with specific, limited powers, and that, when politicians forget that fundamental truth, they become vulnerable to those who remember it. What Americans witnessed in that Senate Banking Committee room on that decisive afternoon wasn't just a political debate. It was a masterclass in how preparation, principle, and constitutional knowledge can triumph over accumulated power and institutional authority. Ted Cruz didn't emerge victorious because he was louder, more aggressive, or more politically connected than Maxine Waters. He won because he understood something fundamental that she had forgotten in America. Political authority must always be grounded in constitutional principle. The contrast could not have been more stark. On one side sat a woman who had wielded power for 34 years, who had accumulated influence and authority through seniority and political maneuvering, who believed that experience and institutional knowledge were sufficient qualifications for leadership. On the other side sat a man who understood that all political power in America flows from a written constitution with specific, limited, enumerated powers, and who had spent his career studying, practicing, and defending those principles. Waters' destruction served as a powerful warning to every career politician who believes that longevity equals legitimacy, that seniority trumps accountability, or that good intentions justify exceeding constitutional bounds. Her systematic dismantling demonstrated that in America, no one, regardless of their position, their experience, or their political connections, is above the Constitution or beyond the reach of constitutional accountability. The hearing revealed something profound about the nature of political authority in a constitutional republic. Waters had accumulated tremendous power and influence over her decades in Washington, but that power was built on shifting political foundations rather than solid constitutional ground. When challenged by someone who understood the actual source of governmental authority, the Constitution itself, her entire edifice of accumulated power crumbled within minutes. Cruz's methodical approach provided a template for how constitutional conservatives should engage in political combat. He came prepared with documents, legal precedents, and specific constitutional arguments. He didn't rely on talking points or partisan rhetoric. Instead, he grounded every argument in the founding principles of American government, making it impossible for Waters to dismiss his challenges as mere political posturing. The hearing also highlighted the critical importance of constitutional literacy in American political leadership. Waters' fundamental ignorance of constitutional law, her inability to articulate the constitutional basis for the policies she had spent decades advocating, revealed the educational and intellectual poverty that had infected much of America's political class. For American voters, the hearing provided a crucial lesson about what to look for in political leadership. The next time a politician claims unlimited authority to solve complex problems, voters should ask them the same question Cruz asked Waters. What constitutional authority gives you that power? The answer will reveal everything voters need to know about whether that politician deserves their trust and support. The hearing demonstrated that constitutional knowledge is not an abstract academic exercise, but a practical political tool that can expose corruption, challenge abuse of power, and hold government officials accountable to the people they serve. Cruz showed that politicians who actually understand the Constitution have a devastating advantage over those who merely assume their own authority. Perhaps most importantly, the hearing reminded every American that our government operates under a written constitution that means what it says. Politicians don't get to expand federal power simply because they have noble goals or good intentions. The Constitution establishes specific, limited powers for specific, limited purposes. When politicians exceed those bounds, as Waters had done repeatedly throughout her career, they violate their oath of office and betray the trust of the American people. Cruz's performance offered hope to constitutional conservatives who had grown weary of political leaders who promised to defend the Constitution but never demonstrated actual knowledge of its contents. Here was a politician who could quote constitutional text from memory, who understood legal precedent and constitutional history, who could make sophisticated legal arguments in accessible language. The hearing also provided a powerful example of how individual preparation and principled conviction can triumph over institutional power and political momentum. Cruz didn't need a large staff, expensive consultants, or media manipulation to achieve victory. He needed only a thorough understanding of constitutional law, careful preparation, and the courage to challenge power with principle. For the constitutional conservative movement, the hearing represented a turning point. It showed that intellectual rigor and constitutional expertise could be more powerful than any other political weapon. It demonstrated that Americans hunger for leaders who understand and can articulate the founding principles of their government. The broader lesson extends beyond partisan politics to the fundamental question of how Americans want to be governed. Do they want leaders who accumulate power through seniority and political maneuvering, or leaders who derive their authority from constitutional principle? Do they want politicians who assume unlimited power to solve problems, or politicians who respect constitutional limits on government authority? Cruz's systematic dismantling of Waters provided a clear answer. Americans responded enthusiastically to principled leadership grounded in constitutional knowledge. They celebrated the triumph of preparation over presumption, of substance over style, of constitutional principle over political power. The hearing will be remembered as a defining moment in American political history, the day when constitutional knowledge proved more powerful than political experience, when preparation triumphed over position, and when the founding principles of American government reminded the political establishment that in this republic, no one is above the Constitution. Ted Cruz walked into that hearing room as a junior senator from Texas, carrying nothing more than a manila folder and a pocket constitution. He walked out as a national political figure who had demonstrated the enduring power of America's founding principles. Maxine Waters walked in as one of the most powerful women in Washington. She walked out as a cautionary tale about what happens when politicians forget that their power comes from the people, is constrained by the Constitution, and must always be subject to accountability. The constitutional scholar from Texas had just reminded everyone watching that in America, the Constitution still matters. Knowledge still trumps power, and the founding principles of limited government remain the best protection against political corruption and abuse of authority. In the end, the hearing wasn't really about banking regulation or financial policy. It was about the fundamental question that has defined American politics since 1787: will we be governed by constitutional principle or by the whims of those who happen to hold power? Ted Cruz provided a resounding answer, and America was better for it. But now, the real question is left to you. When the cameras are off and the viral moments fade, what do you think truly matters more in leadership: 30 years of accumulated power or an unbreakable grasp of the rules that govern it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's debate.